A week in review for week ending 2/26. We covered the last loop briefly. We discussed the for range, and I think before that I also showed you the shortcut if. So we talked about this one. There's a condition: if true, execute this piece, otherwise execute this piece. The example I went over in class was using cout, and I caution you, use this judiciously. Don't just supplant this with over if statements. That's not the intended purpose. Okay, we went on also to cover a for range loop. Before that I showed you how we need to iterate a string with the traditional for loop. We have to be aware of the index and the count and index of 0, which is good to know. But then I showed you how easy the for range loop makes it, mainly because C++ is trying to compete with the other programming languages that have made looping easy, specifically looping of structures like lists or strings. Then we went into functions. So we talked about functions. We talked about how the C++ language has the core and the standard library, and how we've been creating our own small libraries. For every example I create and for every assignment you've done, you've created a library, and those are user-defined libraries, and we can use them in main or with test cases, as we have been doing. Functions help us with organization. They hide the complexity of the code. It enables code reuse. It allows us to test, which in turn allows us to, in the future, add features to our program without fear of breaking it. We talked about functions that do not return a value, void functions. Functions that return a value, value return functions. We briefly talked about parameters. We will talk more in depth about them this coming week. I talked about default arguments. I'll give you a short example. But I also covered the memory piece. We will focus on the stack and the heap memory for this class. And we will take a deep dive into stack memory and how variables are mapped onto stack memory, and how functions are also mapped or stored in memory when we run them. And we will use stack activation records to cover this. So I briefly went over this. I'll show you how when a function is loaded, the activation record is loaded onto the stack, and when another function is called from within that function, like from main, then that function is also called. And remember, the stack is last in first out, so when the function that's called finishes executing, it is removed from the stack. So we'll take a deep dive into that to understand how parameters work. So there's different types of parameters in C++, and using the activation records and how functions are loaded onto the stack will help students understand what's going on when you are programming with functions. We'll get into references, and a reference is a variable clone. Okay, so it's a clone to a variable, and we'll get into this topic, which is important concept for the remainder of the class. We'll also talk about reference variables, function overloading. And then we will also talk about, let me see. No, for now, I think that will probably be what takes up our time this week. There will be a quiz over looping structure, so make sure that you understand how while, for, do while, and for range work. My suggestion is review the examples that I've coded for you so that you can do well in the quiz. Readings for next week. Chapter 6 in Gaddis or 9th, I think it's still chapter 6, got his 9th edition, the chapter about functions. If you're using the free C++ book link, then it's chapter 9. Again, please read the material before you go to class. That'll make it easier for you to follow along. And remember, in class, I don't have time to go into the details of everything, so I can't, right? But if you read the book, then that'll help you understand the concepts that I cover in class. Also, if you have not turned in homework assignments, please turn them in. If you forgot to turn them in, turn them in. Go back into your grades and review to make sure that you don't have zeros for any of your assignments. If you do, then submit it for grading. What else? I think that's it. There will be a quiz. I did say that. Okay, yeah, that's it. Okay. Have a good weekend. I will see you next week.